Pleasure to come out here after been about 10 years coming to the center since the university and Monticello began to partner, and to see the wonderful work that's been done, including this, to be able to sit in this beautiful building is quite an honor. Andrew's right. This work is based upon a paper that I wrote in the mid-1990s, which faded off into blissful academic obscurity because very few people actually had touched on the Barbary War at all. Prior to this paper, I did a search. The last major study of the Barbary War was done in 1931, and prior to that, 1904, because very few Jefferson historians wanted to touch it. It doesn't really fit. Dumas Malone has a very short chapter, and if you look at Tucker and Hendrickson's work, which I'm a critic of in many respects, they put the war in a footnote because it goes against the image of Jefferson as sort of the prototype Wilsonian pacifist. So at the time, it seemed to be just sort of a different interpretation of what I think is a very useful case study to understand Jefferson's thinking on world politics. But as Andrew said, now that we're living in the post-9/11 world, this has been studied from many angles because it is true that Jefferson was the first president to sponsor regime change in the Middle East against the Pasha of Tripoli in 1804. I'll talk about that a little bit. But I'd really like to focus more about the war in the context of late 18th and early 19th century politics and Jefferson's view of the world system. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is lay out one postulate, if you'll forgive my arrogance in doing that, and two arguments which we can bandy around. The first postulate is that the United States and Europe formed a connected state system in the late 18th and early 19th century, and Jefferson and his contemporaries, whatever their political affiliations or differences were, saw themselves as operating within a truly transatlantic state system. Now that probably doesn't strike many of you as radical, but it certainly would to Sam Bemis, other early scholars of American foreign policy, even Felix Gilbert, who very much wanted to look at the United States as walled off or separate from the European balance of power system. And my argument is you can't understand Jefferson and Hamilton if you make that artificial division. So that's my postulate. My first argument to lay out in terms of my interpretation to get to the Barbary War is that despite their various differences on foreign policy, Jefferson and Hamilton, and Federalists and Republicans more generally, were both quote-unquote political realists with very sophisticated strategies for advancing America's national interest. And actually, they agreed on several fundamental principles, which I think it's important to keep in mind when we're looking so much in the literature at the ideological differences between the parties, that they agreed really on three major points of foreign policy. First, the United States was weak and therefore vulnerable in an international system dominated by the Europeans. Second, that the American economy needed time to develop, even though, of course, they differed on how it should develop. And finally, that neutrality of one form or another, whether or not it was a little bit benevolent to France, if you're a Republican, or to England, if you're a Federalist, but the general idea of neutrality and independence was the best way to secure American security at a time of incessant European war. Where Jefferson and Hamilton differ on foreign policy is in their emphasis on immediate rather than potential development of American power in international relations. Hamilton accepts American inferiority as unfortunate, but a real crisis that constrains American diplomatic options. In his view, while America is weak, it must compromise, and it needs to find an external guarantor of its security. And therefore, Hamilton prefers, of course, an entente with England, which provides not only the protection of the Royal Navy, but also access to English markets that he considers to be fundamental to his economic plan. Now, obviously, the cost to Hamilton's vision of world politics is that it has to abide by, to a large extent, British trade policy, which, of course, becomes encapsulated in the Jay Treaty of 1795, but Hamilton believes that with the United States hobbled by no army, no navy, significant debt, and partisan cleavages internally, an entente with England is really the best way to secure American neutrality. Jefferson differs from this quite radically. Jefferson's view of American national security, in my opinion, is based upon equally rational and sober calculations as Hamilton's, but comes to a fundamentally different conclusion. In Jefferson's view, America's neutrality and independence itself could become a potential weapon to be used in bargainings with the Europeans. Jefferson agrees with Hamilton that the United States is weak in the 1790s, but it won't always be that way. Jefferson puts a great deal of emphasis on the future development of America's economy and its military force. And he's worried that Hamilton's strategy, if it becomes institutionalized, would make the United States forever a vassal of one of the European powers. In his words, quote, a second Portugal. And once the United States gets into that groove, it's never going to escape, and therefore the United States is never going to achieve its true potential in world politics. And therefore, if you're Jefferson, the European war, which so terrified Hamilton, is actually a source of strength. Because with their militaries overburdened, starved for raw materials, Jefferson believes that they will look to the United States with a favorable eye, and the United States will have much to offer the Europeans. Now, in Jefferson's view, what Hamilton doesn't get is that the intangible ingredients of power, the things you can't really measure in world politics, are very important. Intimations of friendships, hints of neutrality, benevolent or not, to a rival, and a constant willingness to do business and be receptive to offers from all parties around the globe offer the United States with a comfortable margin of choice in world politics. Jefferson puts it well in 1806 when he argues, quote, what an awful spectacle does the world exhibit at this moment. One man bestriding the continent of Europe like a colossus, the other roaming unbridled on the ocean. But even this is better than one should rule both elements. Our wish ought to be that he who has armies may not have dominion of the sea, and that he who has dominion of the sea may not be the one who has armies. In this way we may be quiet. So in my view, as in the later 19th century case of Bismarck with Austria and Russia, Jefferson is seeking to place the United States in an avowedly neutral position between rivals and manipulate their antagonisms to America's advantage, and above all, keep the United States out of a war from which it can gain very little and bargain for individual concessions on the margins from rival states. So Jefferson puts this well in what I think is the most important national security document that he puts forward in a systematic way, and that's the Report on Commerce, which I know has been scrutinized a great deal. Drew McCoy, of course, focused on this. But when Jefferson puts this forward in December of 1793, I consider this to be a confession of faith of his view of America's role in world politics, and it's one that's put forward in a very pedestrian method of the late 18th century. If you look more broadly at world politics, what Jefferson has to say in that report is something that really any European statesman since the time of Colbert could have put forward. As a branch of industry, he writes, commerce is valuable, but as a resource of defense, essential. Its value as a branch of industry is enhanced by the dependence of so many other branches on it. But it is a resource of defense that our navigation will admit neither of negligence nor forbearance. The position and circumstance of the United States leave them nothing to fear on their land board and leave them nothing to desire beyond their present rights. But on the seaboard, they are open to injury, and they have there too a commerce which must be protected. Now this argument, the protection of commerce, is, as I said, quite pedestrian in the broader corpus of late 18th century political writing. Distilled to its fundamentals, what Jefferson is saying is that a small state that depends on trade for a large percentage of its national revenue cannot compete in the international system as long as its commerce was vulnerable to attack, seizure, or prohibitive duties. So the extension, to take this one step further, is that the United States is part of what Jefferson sees as an Atlantic balance of power, which also includes the great European trading nations of Spain, Britain, and France. The economic and strategic networks that compose this balance could be manipulated by the United States to serve its ends in a European war, and Jefferson never ceases to maintain that if America's independence, lucrative resources, and freedom from, quote, entangling alliances, as he puts it in the first inaugural, were properly managed, it could not only secure its borders, but prosper in a polarized international system. To this end, when Jefferson finds out that Hamilton has told George Hammond, the British attaché in Washington, that the United States would, in Philadelphia rather at that time, that the United States would remain neutral in the European war, Jefferson argues that Hamilton gave away what the United States might have sold at considerable price. And Jefferson believes that this balance of power is a natural, his word, component of the late 18th century international system, and that American politicians, regardless of what their ideological views may be internally, could not ignore it. Jefferson sarcastically endorsed a, quote, meridian of partition between the continents and argued that the United States should divorce itself from Britain, Spain, and France, but in his more thorough analyses, he was far too aware of the workings of world politics to ever think about isolation. Remember that entangling alliances does not advocate an isolationist policy. It means exactly what Jefferson said by that adjective. The United States should avoid an entangling or exclusive alliance that would make the United States a partner of one state against another. Jefferson rejects isolation as, quote, theory only, and a theory which the servants of America are not at liberty to follow. Our people have a decided taste for navigation and commerce. They take this from their mother country, and their servants are in duty bound to calculate all their measures on this datum. We wish to do it by throwing open the doors of commerce and knocking off its shackles. So Jefferson, therefore, is one who recognizes that the United States has to operate in this commercial game. Even though the British and the French started it, it's the existing system, and the United States could at best manipulate it, and manipulate it shrewdly, but it can't avoid it. And what I believe he does is advocate a two-tier approach to international relations. Now, this argument is somewhat controversial in the literature, and no doubt some of you may want to question me about it. That is, Jefferson basically argues that world politics operates in two spheres. That is, England and France, the great European powers on one hand, and then Spain in the west, the states in North Africa, the Dutch, Sardinia, Piedmont, the weaker neutrals in Europe, states, in other words, that were not in an immediate position to cause direct injury to the physical integrity of the United States. And Jefferson argues that the United States should deal with these countries based upon their relative power. He distinguishes between Britain and France on the one hand, and Spain in the Mississippi Delta after 1786, or the so-called Barbary states in the Mediterranean that we'll talk about in some detail in a few minutes, at the level of power that those states actually have. And what this means is that in practice, he favors adopting a policy of commercial retaliation against the great European powers and the use of direct military force against weaker states that could not immediately harm the United States. And in his view, these policies of Tier 1, commercial retaliation, and Tier 2, the use of military force, would be reinforcing in his mind in the United States' attempt to constantly gain support for its neutral rights. So now this first-tier argument only works, commercial retaliation, when the United States has a very significant volume of trade with the states in question. This would be effective, at least in theory, with England and France, in which there's a large volume of goods through American ports. And of course, Jefferson's idea of commercial retaliation culminates in the embargo of 1807, which for reasons of time we really can't consider here. But this in the second tier, and that's what we're going to focus on this afternoon, that is the weaker states, the Spains in the West, the North African regimes in the Mediterranean, Jefferson is extremely quick to rattle and use the saber to defend American interests. As early as 1784, Jefferson champions the creation of a navy to fight the, quote, frequent wars without a doubt, unquote, which the United States would have to wage in order to assert its power relative to secondary maritime powers. With his characteristic realism, Jefferson commented that it was likely that American property, quote, will be violated on the sea and in foreign ports. American persons will be insulted, imprisoned, and etc. for pretended debts, contracts, crimes, contraband, etc. These insults must be resented to prevent their eternal repetition. The justest dispositions possible in ourselves will not secure us against it. It would be necessary that all the nations were just also. Justice on our part will save us from those wars which would have been produced by a contrary disposition. But how to prevent those produced by the wrongs of other nations? By putting ourselves in a condition to punish them. Weakness provokes insult and injury, while a condition to punish it often presents it. This reasoning leads to the necessity of some naval force, that being the only weapon with which we can reach an enemy. I think it to our interest to punish the first insult, because an insult unpunished is the parent of many others. We are not at this moment in a condition to do it, but we should put ourselves into it as soon as possible. So no turning the other cheek here. This is a very hard line towards weaker states that the United States could fight effectively with very little cost to the direct security of the country. And Jefferson is very quick to argue that that must always be the case, that the United States should only fight wars in a case where it's likely to prevail with minimal cost, rather than to ever attempt to take on the capital fleets of England and France, which is, of course, one of the reasons why he opposes Adams' quasi-war in 1798. So Jefferson sees no reason to offer tribute to the North Africans or to pay dearly early on for West Florida after the Louisiana Purchase, when the United States could actually gain control of these areas, or at least favorable commercial rights, in a war that was more cost-benefit, more appropriate in terms of a cost-benefit analysis for the benefits it would gain. Now let's talk a little bit about the issue at hand, the Barbary War. What I've attempted to do, perhaps too quickly or too theoretically, is sketch out how Jefferson's approaching world politics, because I think it's extremely important to do so before we actually get to the case study of the Mediterranean, because the studies that we have frequently ignore Jefferson's broader view of world politics and sort of pick up right with the issues there. So what's going on? Where does Jefferson sort of come into this? By the late 18th century, the so-called Barbary states, which is of course a completely erroneous title, these are actually small city-states that are nominally under the control of the Ottoman Sultan. Algiers, Tunis, Morocco, and Tripoli are the four major ones. By the late 18th century, these are thriving centers of legitimate trade and outright piracy. The Sultan nominally controls North Africa, but the Ottoman Empire has fallen into decrepit condition after the war with Russia from 1768 to 1774, and therefore these princes have extraordinary latitude in the conduct of their political affairs. And what they're doing, essentially to keep their navies occupied, as well as to raise foreign capital, is to seize ships in the Mediterranean and ransom off the crews. And what this does is cause insurance rates to spike all across Europe and the United States, and also causes instances whereby ransom demands would increase. Meeting a ruler's terms only increased his demands the next time and led to greater instances of piracy. Peace treaties with these states, the only a defense against seizure on the high seas, ships actually had to carry records that they were at peace with these states, were purchased at roughly £1 million by the 1790, which is an extraordinary sum at the time. Now, England and France, both of which were very active and had active consulates in North Africa, exploited this situation to their advantage. They found it much cheaper to pay them off, because it was actually, at a time of when they were at war with each other, better than sending naval squadrons and going about all that inconvenience of and bother of destroying them. And also because what they would do is form a peace treaty and then encourage them to prey on the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Sweden, Russia, the United States, all the weak rivals that, of course, the British and the French want to kick out of the Mediterranean. As Britain's Lord Sheffield put it well in 1783, quote, "that the Barbary states are advantageous to the maritime powers is certain. If they were suppressed, the little states of Italy and etc. would have much more of the carrying trade," unquote. So therefore, the continental diplomats view these pirates as very important pawns of the European balance of power. Franklin writes back in 1783 that, quote, "if there was no Algiers, it would be worth England's while to build one." And that's certainly a very popular sentiment at the time. Now, after America achieves independence and is no longer protected under the flag of England and the protection of the Royal Navy, attacks on American shipping increase markedly, and they drive insurance rates to exorbitant levels and actually force many private firms to cut back on shipments to the Mediterranean. It also leads to all sorts of plight or discussions of the plight of Americans in captivity. It's all over the newspapers. It's very similar to what we saw in the late 1980s in the Reagan administration with the hostages in Lebanon. There's sort of these heartstrings accounts, and families are visiting Adams and Jefferson in Europe, begging them to try and free their husbands and fathers, etc. And therefore, the weak Confederation government has a problem on its hands, and that is how to deal with these so-called pirates of the Mediterranean. Now, after 1785, they've got a fairly large collection of American ships and sailors with which to bargain. Adams and Jefferson are constantly besieged with these appeals to try and negotiate and do the best they can to release Americans, but they don't really have much money, and there's very little political will to do anything effective. Adams studies the British policy, and he is absolutely convinced that the British have the right idea. That is, the smart thing to do is to copy from the British example, raise money, pay them off, because then the British and the French will look to the Americans as sort of copying them, and that there'll be sort of this flattery by imitation. And Adams actually very helpfully offers to float a loan with his friends in Amsterdam to pay off Tripoli and Algiers in 1786 in order to secure the release of Americans. He argues, quote, "It will be wisest for us to negotiate and pay the necessary sum without loss of time." Jefferson thinks that this is patently absurd. He understands the logic of the days, the name for the princes of these states, strategy quite well. And he believes that this is going to become a situation of rope-a-dope, whereby if the United States pays off one country, there's going to be increased demands from others, and the United States is going to ratchet up its loans on the European market to achieve at the end very little. Plus, if you provide tribute to these states, which is what they wanted, naval stores, masts, canvas, ships, you're only providing them with the very ammunition that they're going to use against Americans in the future. Therefore, according to Jefferson, it's much cheaper to build a navy and fight them than to buy them off. Jefferson argues to James Monroe in 1786 that, quote, "If Congress makes peace by negotiation, they must pay a great sum of money. If they do nothing, they must pay a great sum of money in the form of insurance, and in either way as great a one and probably less effectual than in the way of force." So Jefferson has absolutely no interest in getting trapped in this endless cycle of ransom and insurance rates being escalated beyond American ability to pay. Also, Jefferson argues that the Barbary states, as they were known, provides a very convenient excuse for demonstrating American willingness to defend its trade to the Europeans in the Mediterranean under the guns of the British and French navies. And Jefferson believes that this is a wonderful opportunity for the United States to show how serious it is about rattling the saber to defend its trade. He writes to Monroe in 1784 that, quote, "We ought to begin a naval power if we mean to carry on our commerce. Can we begin it on a more honorable occasion or with a weaker foe? I am of the opinion that John Paul Jones with half a dozen frigates would totally destroy their commerce, not by attempting bombardments as the Mediterranean states do when they act against the whole Barbary force brought to a point, but by constant cruising and cutting them to pieces piecemeal. Constant American presence, frequent attacks on shipping from Algeria, from Algiers and Tunis, and slowly eroding the ability of these states to capture American merchantmen. Only this kind of assertive policy would provide the security that Jefferson wants in the Mediterranean." Now, Jefferson realizes, after Adams talks him out of it, that there's no way Congress is going to appropriate his strategy of building a navy. There was no political will, there was no money. But he comes up with this ingenious idea that I know many of you have read about, and that is the anti-piratical confederacy. And what this brainchild was for the United States to deal, much as the way Catherine the Great had done with her armed neutrality in 1780, with all of the weak neutral states that were being preyed on by the Barbary pirates, the Swedes, the Dutch, the Italians, and actually each state would contribute 1 or 2 frigates, and it would form sort of an international collaborative force that would be in constant cruising. Therefore, the United States doesn't have to ante up the whole force, and it would be more palatable to Congress. But the British and the French are not willing to take this on. They're unwilling to jeopardize the balance of power, and Adams is told in London and Jefferson in Paris to cease and desist on this discussion. Vergennes tells Jefferson that this is not something that the French government wants to hear. So Jefferson, therefore, is talked out of the idea of the anti-piratical confederacy, and from 1785 all the way to 1801, American North African policy is fairly consistent. The United States Navy improves, of course, in this period, in the quality and quantity of ships and sailors, but the political will for an attack, an offensive force against the North African regimes is absent. The American government continues to pay tribute in this 15-year period to all 4 principal North African states. A treaty is signed with Morocco in 1795, and one with Algiers for $1 million, negotiated, not surprisingly, by the Adams government, finalized in 1797. Although Tripoli and Tunis were feted with lavish presents, naval stores, masts, guns were delivered, these states were much more intransigent in their dealings with the United States. And in early 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli, declares war on the United States on the grounds that the Algerians had received more money from the Americans than his kingdom, and Jefferson, who's just been inaugurated as president, faces a problem. That is a new war in the Mediterranean. But in 1801, Jefferson now has the political power and the naval strength that had eluded him in the 1780s. He was determined to assert American commercial rights in the Mediterranean in the manner that he had advocated for the past 17 years. And in his view, the actions of Tripoli provided him all of the excuse that he needed. although word of the formal declaration of war by Tripoli does not reach Washington until June 1801, reports of increased attacks on American ships pointed to the obvious conclusion, and Jefferson, by mid-May 1801, is calling the cabinet together to discuss options. The real alternative, he writes, this is June 2nd, is whether to abandon the Mediterranean or to keep up a cruise in it. Since the 1780s, Jefferson's never doubted that a military operation is the most effective way to deal with these states, and he argues buying a settlement through tribute is, quote, is pointless. I am convinced it is money thrown away, and that there is no end to the demand of these powers, nor any security in their promises. Now, there is absolutely no historiographic record of Jefferson's decision for war, except fragmentary notes of a cabinet meeting that he made on May 15th, 1801. And it's very interesting because Jefferson, in my view, consciously attempts to minimize the record on the Barbary War. He campaigns, of course, on a platform of peace in 1800. His Republican allies would not be sympathetic at all to sending an offensive force to the Mediterranean. As a matter of fact, John Randolph gives him all forms of argument later over it. And because Jefferson is quite conscious of the fact that this military venture may fail, and he wants to keep himself politically distanced from it. The meeting focuses only on, quote, the expediency of a cruise in Jefferson's writing. Jefferson leaves absolutely no record of what he said at the meeting, but keeps careful notes of what Levy, Gallatin, and Madison do. Madison, in a letter to William Eaton, who's the American consul in Tunis, stated clearly that Jefferson saw this as an appropriate moment to use American naval power in the Mediterranean as, quote, not only is it a provision against an immediate danger, but as we are now at peace and amity with all the rest of the world, and as the force employed would, if at home, be merely at the same expense with less advantage to our mariners. So the meeting is not about whether to declare war. Jefferson's made his mind up on that. It's really about how it should be handled. As it was doubtful that Congress would provide Jefferson with the political and financial support he needed to wage a campaign, the primary reason of the meeting is to discuss the constitutional and financial aspects of a campaign. According to Jefferson's notes, Madison vigorously argued that it was important that the war be declared to all states, that is, an open avowal of hostilities, which would demonstrate American willingness to assert its neutral rights. And it ends really with a decision to dispatch a squadron of frigates to the Mediterranean with a large open-ended mandate to cruise against Tripoli and any other state that assaulted American shipping. Interestingly, the war was financed in part by a special sinking fund, the Mediterranean Fund, that Gallatin put together, modeled on the very British practices that Jefferson had condemned as unethical in the 1790s, which used special loans to defray anything that overran the naval budget. So Jefferson's conducting this war with an eye towards great power politics. As he argued in 1806, the year after the treaty with Tripoli was signed, the love of peace which we sincerely feel and profess has begun to produce an opinion in Europe that our government is entirely in Quaker principles and will turn the left cheek when the right has been smitten. This opinion must be corrected when just occasion arises, or we shall become the plunder of all nations. So Jefferson believes that the United States will be rewarded for this operation in Europe, not only because it will augment its power and standing in the European cabinets by a willingness to use force, but also because the United States would be changing the balance of power by destroying the offensive capability of these regimes. But what's interesting is that once Jefferson basically sends his initial orders out in 1801 and establishes the general direction of the war, he does very little. He doesn't involve himself, actually, much in the war. He doesn't micromanage the military commanders. He's very keen on reading as much as he can what's coming back from Preble and Barron, the American naval commanders in the region, but he attempts again to keep himself distant from the campaign itself. Jefferson, despite the loss of the frigate Philadelphia in October of 1803 after it runs aground, gives the Navy wide latitude to conduct the campaign as it sees fit. Admiral Nelson, who learns of the burning of the captured Philadelphia by Stephen Decatur, who led the squad to torch it, calls it the most bold and daring act of the age. And the Royal Navy does devote considerable attention to American military tactics in the Mediterranean. So at least in that regard, Jefferson gets what he wants. Jefferson is committed to an independent policy in the Mediterranean, but he's constantly dealing with the Dutch, the Swedes, who are sort of the go-betweens between the Americans and the Tripolitan government.
trying to get as much money as he can from the small European traders who have been also harassed by these states. He makes an overture to Tsar Alexander of Russia, arguing that perhaps Russia could use its influence with the Ottoman Sultan to restrain these states. Alexander says, yeah, sure, but we want your aid in our war against Napoleon, and that sort of ends that correspondence. Jefferson's not willing to go to that length, but he's demonstrating a very sophisticated appraisal of European politics in this period. But what I think is actually the most interesting aspect, and Andrew touched on this in his introduction, aspect of this whole campaign is the American attempt to overthrow the sitting government of Tripoli with military force. Eaton, who's the consul in Tunis, comes up with this brilliant scheme. And that is, he picks up on the fact that Yusuf Karamanli has actually been ascended to the throne in 1798 by overthrowing his brother Hamid. Hamid has a very strong coterie of support still within Tunis, and therefore what Eaton proposes is that the United States back Hamid and attempt to overthrow Yusuf by force, including the American Marines. His logic, therefore, is that when Hamid becomes prince, he will immediately free all the American captives, including the crew of the Philadelphia, and will then negotiate favorable treaties with the United States. Now, he goes back to the United States in late 1803 to pitch this to Madison and Jefferson. Madison argues that, quote, although it does not accord with the general sentiments or views of the United States to intermeddle in the domestic context of other countries, it cannot be unfair in the prosecution of a just war or the accomplishment of a reasonable peace to turn to their advantage the enmity and pretensions of others against a common foe. To translate that wonderful, lofty diplomatic phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Jefferson believes very firmly that Eaton's plan is worthy of, quote, a small investment. Eaton returns in November of 1804, gets a connection of American Marines, marches across the desert of modern Libya, and lays siege to the town of Derna in April of 1805, seizing it in the middle of that month and getting ready to march on to Tripoli. His plan, of course, is to eventually march to Tripoli with his ragtag band of Tunisian and renegade Tripolitan forces, and then meet up with Samuel Barron's force. He's the commander of the American force in the harbor. With that sort of two-pronged attack, Yusuf, the Pasha of Tripoli, would then suddenly release all the American captives and negotiate a treaty. However, Barron doesn't do this. Barron knows that the force led by Eaton is coming, but he believes that the Americans have great military superiority at this present time, and he and Tobias Lear, who is the ranking American diplomat in the region, negotiate a peace with Yusuf, which basically allows the United States to have the 300-member crew of the Philadelphia released, and they pay $60,000. Now, this violates Jefferson's principle of the payment of tribute. Nevertheless, the Americans have utterly vitiated the Tripolitan Navy. And therefore, what Barron believes is that by paying this last bit of tribute, by the way, $60,000 is not $1 million, which is originally what the prince wanted, he would then be able to end things, and the war would finally be concluded. Yusuf signs on the dotted line on June 4th, 1805, and critics, including Eaton, who's an incessant critic of Jefferson after this time, argue that this was a squandered peace, that with his force coming in, there should have been no ransom paid, and that Eaton could actually have done far more by installing Hamid as Pasha of Tripoli than Barron got with this negotiation. I'm not going to go in all the ins and outs of it. We could discuss it if you'd like. What Barron argued was that there was absolutely no way to prevent the crew of the Philadelphia from being executed. If either Eaton had launched an attack from the land or Barron had bombarded it from the sea, there was nothing that could be done. They both believed that Yusuf would immediately have slaughtered the 320-odd Americans, and therefore, in order to safeguard American lives, Barron believed that it was logical to pay a small amount of tribute and end the war. Eaton again believes, and there's been an argument on this ever since, as to whether or not Jefferson got the best deal. Federalist critics of Jefferson took up the cause of Hamid, so did John Randolph after 1806, and argued that Jefferson squandered a friend of the United States. What's important is Jefferson believes that this deal gets him what he wants. The worst offenses against American shipping in the Mediterranean end in 1805. They continue till 1816, but Jefferson believes that he has demonstrated, as he writes to Gallatin, quote, we are prepared, like the great European powers, to repel every injury by the sword. Even Pope Pius VII, when he heard of Tripoli's surrender, claimed that the Americans, with a small force and in a short space of time, have done far more for the cause of Christianity than the most powerful nations of Christendom have done for ages. One can only wonder what Jefferson thought of the Pope's endorsement. Nevertheless, Jefferson believes that the United States has scored its advantage with the deal of 1805. What's also less reported is that in 1806, Tunis dispatches an emissary, Meli, to the United States to negotiate with Jefferson. This is at a time when neither Russia nor Sweden have active consulates in the United States. This was radical stuff, that Tunis would send a full-ranking ambassador to the United States to open negotiations. And to Jefferson, this demonstrates that the United States has indeed changed the balance of power to its favor in the Mediterranean by, as he put it, cutting them to pieces piecemeal, as well as orchestrating a coup against a foreign government. Jefferson believes that he has scored all of the advantages that he had been seeking since the 1780s. So I believe that the Barbary War, in conclusion, demonstrates not only a practical expression of the theory of international relations that I've talked about in terms of how Jefferson views world politics, especially that second tier of dealing with weaker powers, but it also puts this war in context, which I'm worried about in the modern view would somewhat be perverted. That is, we tend to look at this war in the early 21st rather than the early 19th century incarnations. In his great biography of Bismarck, Otto Flansen noted that the essence of the German chancellor's genius in foreign policy was, quote, his capacity to see manifold interconnections between political phenomena, not only their actual, but also their potential links, that is, their mutual vulnerability to common manipulation. In my view, he could equally have written the same about Jefferson, who operated from a very sophisticated and quote-unquote realist assessment of world politics and distinguished well between levels of threat in the international system. Thank you for your patience.
Well, before we take questions, I just want to introduce two of our current fellows who've just arrived. George Boudreau, who's the editor of the Journal of Early American Studies and former fellow here, as incidentally is James Sofka, and Tom Vaughan, who's also returning, who's working on cataloguing all of Jefferson's library books, in addition to those listed in Millicent Sardi. And I'd also like to welcome you to take some water or lemonade, which we have here, if you would like some. Your paper actually answered a question that's always bemused me, which is why Britain didn't take the lead in suppressing the Barbary Corsairs. It, after all, had the largest navy. Linda Collis recently written a book called Captives, which actually describes the enslavement of the British and others by the Barbary Corsairs. You certainly quoted Lord Sheffield to the effect that one of the reasons was that they felt that the Italians or some of the other states might similarly take up the similar enterprises, and that essentially the Barbary Corsairs are culling them. Do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Sure. No, I think that actually captures it. The French did launch a major campaign against Algiers and Tunis in 1745. They brought a capital fleet in, shelled the cities. Some hostages were released, but many were executed. And after this, it basically left to the, and then here we're still left with a very contemporary situation, that once these states were actually in physical possession of these captives and treating them rather brutally, there wasn't much to be done to safeguard them. And sooner or later, there was going to have to be some negotiated settlement. So therefore, the British, especially when their navy was needed in their mind for far better things, such as attacking the Spanish and the French, believed that simply paying them, which they could afford to do, was a more effective means of buying off these corsairs. Now, they didn't always follow the treaties. There were some cases where British ships were seized. This did lead to occasional attacks, but nothing of a major scope. The French did not launch a major enterprise against them after 1745, and the weaker states, the Russians, the Swedes, the Dutch, simply didn't have the means to do so. Jefferson believes that following an assertive policy demonstrates that America was going to sort of divorce itself from British practice. If you look at Adams' correspondence with Jefferson in 1785 and 86, Adams believes that the British will respect the United States by the United States doing what they do, that this sort of will give America a seat at the table by copying London's policy. Jefferson never believes it, that the British will only regard the United States as weak by following such a policy.
And it's gone on hundreds of years.
Oh, this had gone on since the mid-15th century.
Did Jefferson ever criticize Europe's pusillanimity towards the Barbary concepts?
He did. He believed that ultimately it led nowhere, because if you look at what the insurance rates were, they were exorbitant. And he believed that the money that was being paid out to insure freight in the Mediterranean would more than offset the construction costs of capital frigates over the long haul. And therefore, basically his view is these states operated like typical bullies. And once they realized that they would get a black eye in dealing with a particular regime, they'd find somebody weaker to attack. And that's essentially the logic of the British and French proposals, that these states kept, as you said, culled any potential trade rivals in the Mediterranean, which was quite lucrative. Sarah. I think they do, in the sense that and I wouldn't dispute the argument, and certainly Jefferson, as Leonard Levy put it, is smothered in localism, and you could see all these different allegiances in him, and we could spend, obviously, weeks and weeks here in discussion about where Jefferson's primary allegiance was when in his political career. I find that generally that Jefferson's more favorable to federal power when he's running the federal government, and that before and after he's a little bit more skeptical, but that's another point. Hamilton and Jefferson realized that whatever their local attachments might be, they recognized that this corporate entity of the United States or the Confederation was vulnerable to European attack, and that therefore, just as in the Revolutionary War, they would have to band together in some way in order to offset that threat. And even Jefferson in 1786, I didn't quote from this letter, but if you look at this correspondence with Monroe and Adams, when he's fuming at how weak the Confederation government is, it provides no ability for him to negotiate, he argues that, quote, the states must see the rod, that Congress must demonstrate firmness to them and tax them, and use this money for national defense. So I think that demonstrates a conception of national security. It may not be national security in as broad a sense as we mean it today, but they certainly have a plan, a strategy for augmenting American power in the international system. What I'm arguing against is what I consider to be this sterile debate that, Jefferson is this liberal pacifist, if you read Tucker and Hendrickson, and Hamilton's the realist, and that Hamilton, and that is utterly pregnant with arguments that come from after the Second World War and mean nothing when we look at it in the context of the early 19th century. These men were both political realists. They differed. They had very different views of what the level of threat was in the international system. But Hamilton's argument that the United States should seek an alliance with England, or the more radical Republican view, to Genet certainly in 1793, that it should be the same deal only with France, was a very realist argument because the United States was weak and it needed a friend. Jefferson's argument that if we follow that course, we will forever relegate ourselves to being a vassal of whichever country, England or France, we pick, is also, in my opinion, a very sophisticated and realist strategy. So what I'm attempting to do in this paper and some of my other work that's come out is to change the debate, to get us away from that American-centric view of looking at Hamilton and Jefferson and realize that they were part of a much larger international system, and they saw themselves as part of that larger system. Oh, well, I think, well, there certainly is in the West if you look at Spain. If you look at Jefferson's attitude, and I actually just recently did a paper as part of a study that Peter Castor edited on the Louisiana Purchase. I contributed an essay on Jefferson's strategy to the West. I see it being exactly the same policy as he does towards the Mediterranean. It actually intrigued me to pursue this topic further in a book-length study when I saw how much Jefferson's view towards Spain in the 1790s, in which he's effectively arguing, why should we attempt to get involved in complex negotiations when eventually we're going to populate this territory and we can just take it, which would be far cheaper. He certainly advocates this over West Florida after the purchase is consummated in 1803. It really is the same logic as what you see in North Africa, and Jefferson says as much in his correspondence. And I think that really leads me to respect Jefferson more as a strategic thinker, that he's able to see how these very disparate territories are related in his view of the international system. I'm not so sure about Canada. Jefferson deals with this on and off, but certainly the case in the Mississippi Delta. There is no reason to pay a large sum of money for what the United States can take through a war which not only will be cheaper, but will also have the side effect of getting the Europeans to respect us as a great naval power.
I have two questions. I'll see how my hands are shooting up and see where. First one is historiographical.
Sure.
I have to admit I never thought about the Barbary Wars at all. In my career, I believe I two simultaneously. Both, not with any planning, both showed up to work on the Barbary situation.
And when was this, by the way?
Marty wrote on us.
My year.
Yeah,
One
was
of
he
them is currently at Sweetgrass.
Yeah, Marty wrote on us. And both it's published in some issue of Early American Studies. Something out here, but I can't pull in it because they can let them out. So I'll get you a copy. If you give me a thread, I'll get you a copy. It's two very good articles, and we joked that the Barbary special issue. And didn't put it on the cover.
It was much more sort of cultural history, right? Rather than
Not diplomatic.
I'm very interested historiographically in the fact that this has long been, and in my broader paper, on the fact that Jefferson scholars have virtually and consciously ignored what they consider to be an objectionable campaign.
I think that in the midst of editing these two articles, which was a slow process, we also read Colley's book, which I know is fascinating, again, captivity is the only thing we've dealt with in a very long time. And I wonder, listening to you, I'm not a mathematics, so how much is the average Jefferson because of where they're from, what their experience is? In reading what you said, what you opened my eyes to, maybe Adam's ideas growing up are so much for the one that he's from with the smell of salt water. And he would have known boys in his community who had known these sailors. And Colley's argument that everybody in the English world is that there was someone, even in his fourth cousin, who ended up captain, and this is a constant nagging presence in their cultural identity. And also for Adams is in New England. And Adams eventually was put up with the Catholics, but he never liked them much. And I think a lot of his identity still remains what Robert was talking about. The intense fear that any minute the Pope soldiers will fall into the British zone and start capturing the Protestants and take them all to that country. And this nagging New Englanders even in the centuries to an extent. How much of Jefferson's willing to go forward, as you say, or willing to make a decision? Because he's been experienced
It may be. I haven't thought about it that way, and that's actually a very good angle. I actually don't, in my reading, see them differing as to the problem. I think Jefferson feels as passionately about the problem as does Adams. I mean, he doesn't have probably the personal connection, certainly when you're looking at it from the standpoint of Virginia versus Massachusetts and the people that Adams had known throughout his life and heard in Boston of this. You're right. Jefferson would probably not have had that kind of firsthand experience. But Jefferson certainly hears it when he's in Paris, and he is just inundated with letters and visitors to his office about this problem. And he feels as aggressively as Adams that even whether or not his personal affiliation with specific people, that this is something, Sarah's question, this is a national security problem. The United States cannot compete in the Mediterranean. We cannot develop that trade as long as this is going on. So Adams's argument, Adams likes Jefferson's idea of boldness. I mean, he thinks that's wonderful. He's a little bit more of a pragmatist and says, look, there's no way that Congress is going to go with this strategy. I mean, we can't recommend it because they're going to laugh at you. So it isn't so much, and there is the view that, okay, the British will like us more if we negotiate and simply pay large amounts of money. So you could very well be right that there is certainly a regional and biographical issue here that my more abstract reading of this in terms of external politics would overlook. But I think at the end of the day, it reinforces it. It gets us back to the same problem, if I'm reading your interpretation correctly. Oops. Right. I'm glad you... Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because in my, I'm having to abridge a lot of these comments. Adams actually argued that that was wrong, that, quote, the Navy was Jefferson's child. This is what Adams writes to Jefferson. I believe it's in 1822. I have to go back to Caput and look it up. But Adams credits Jefferson with the development of the American Navy in the Mediterranean. And certainly many people have looked at, have argued that one of the reasons why the United States does so well from a naval point of view in the War of 1812 is the fact that the Navy developed a lot of the tactics it would use in the Mediterranean. And that actually that provided a wonderful school, as it were, for American combat tactics. So I agree. I think actually, and this is why when Tucker and Hendrickson, you could see how their distaste at wanting to even look at this, or Reginald Stewart's treatment of Jefferson as, quote, the halfway pacifist, because looking at this, Jefferson developing the Navy, favoring naval construction, which, by the way, is interesting. In 1784, he wants a Navy. In 1804, he wants a Navy. In 1794, he criticizes the Navy. But of course, that's when the Federalists held political power, and he's worried that the Navy would become a tool of federalism. I think that's very important, and one of the historiographic reasons that many people ignore this is that it portrays Jefferson as much more muscular in world politics than either his Republican then or now followers or his Federalist then or now critics would want to admit. But Adams certainly gave him full credit for it. Yeah, losing the Philadelphia would be like losing a ballistic missile submarine in terms of its cost at this time and its political significance. You're right, the Navy's small. And by 1805, Barron's got 30 ships in the Mediterranean, which is fairly impressive. There's only 4 major frigates and several smaller ones. Jefferson, therefore, aggressively talks about this building spree. We need to build more of these ships. But he also talks about the gunboat issue, and that's something that some people have looked at and said, well, Jefferson likes these little piddling gunboats, so that must mean that he's a good Republican. He doesn't like the big capital ships. And that's absolute fantasy, because the reason he wants these gunboats is because, guess what? In shallow waters of the Mediterranean or in the Mississippi Delta, you need a shallow draft craft. And therefore, he has this idea that these gunboats would get towed over by the big frigates. Then they could operate close to shore, which is where the Corsairs did. Because the problem with the Philadelphia, of course, was that it was too big to operate where it did. So, yeah, I mean, where we could criticize Jefferson is that you're right. He has, to some extent, his appetite is larger than his teeth in the sense of what he wants to do with the power at his disposal. But he also believes that you could capture some of these ships. You can begin to start allying with some of the Europeans, like the Swedes, who have some medium, sort of moderate level frigates. So the United States could sort of co-opt some of the naval power at once. But again, and this is where I would say Jefferson is vulnerable to criticism, is that, and where Hamilton was right, I think, is this view of America's potential power, not now, but 10 or 20 years from now, leads Jefferson into some degree of trouble. It certainly does with the embargo in 1807 or 1808. And Jefferson, therefore, favors the development of this naval force, and he believes a successful Barbary campaign will give him the ability to go to Congress and get more. Anything else? Yeah. I'm from the north, too, so. Jefferson, I mean, it's there all over. I mean, I wouldn't certainly say that race didn't play a part, but I wouldn't see Jefferson, my view, and maybe some of you will laugh at me for saying this, I wouldn't see Jefferson doing much different if these were captives of Sweden. and Sweden followed exactly the same policy, I think you would see an equally muscular Jeffersonian response. Certainly the Islamic element, the discussion of conversions, although Jefferson's not all that, he doesn't care all that much about conversions. It is more to Adams than it is to Jefferson. And certainly after, by the way, when the crew of the Philadelphia is released, 7 Americans elect to remain in Tripoli at this time. They convert to Islam and they live their lives in this region. It's more about the commercial aspect of Jefferson. It's more about the ability of these states to project power and wound the ability of the United States to carry on a commercial traffic. So race is sort of, it's icing on the cake. It's not causal in my mind. I think actually that's a case where I'll stake my own biases and say you can go a little too far with the racial equation when it comes to world politics, because it does get us away from some of the profit and loss calculations that I see Jefferson and Hamilton making that are more race neutral. But again, that's my approach is coming at this from the diplomatic history side, and I don't believe from my broader reading of Jefferson that it made all that much difference. Well, there was a very interesting way he accommodated him. Jefferson did study this, and actually in one of the most famous footnotes I've ever written, which I threw away, but everybody's quoted, is that Jefferson, the ambassador Melly indicated that he was lonely and would want some companionship. And Jefferson and Madison arranged for companionship to be provided, and it's if you look actually in the paperwork, it demonstrates that Madison appropriates, they hired a Greek prostitute for him, and if you look in the state, and I actually would not have believed this if I didn't see it, it says that, quote, Madison writes a $200 expense as, quote, appropriations for foreign intercourse. So this is actually in the State Department budget. So they are smoothing the ambassador's way as much as they can. I mean, so cultural or not, this definitely demonstrates an awareness of sophisticated negotiating strategies at the time.
This issue also had contemporary, or has contemporary resonance, in that it had budget implications.
Yes.
If I remember rightly, it annoyed Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, in that it spoiled many of his plans for balancing the budget.
Oh, yes. And not only that, but Jefferson had condemned European sinking funds, which is basically off-the-record expenses he considered a, quote, monarchical tactic that kings used to finance wars, because essentially his whole argument was that when you had the budgetary process away from the people and its representatives, you invite mischief. But that's exactly what Jefferson did. He financed this war, by and large, off the books by sort of fudging the budget, because he recognized that Congress wasn't going to go for it, and it was going to go very much against the sentiments of even his Republican allies. So it demonstrates here the extent to which Jefferson's willing to abandon a lot of his declared political principles for the sake of, whatever you may call it, national security.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.